All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. And today we are joined by Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge David Borowski. Won't you please give him a warm welcome to Marquette University Law School. Good to have you here. So, the idea of inviting Judge Borowski to the law school began with a coffee, I think, back last summer at some point. We sat down and visited for about an hour or so, talking about a variety of issues, and I was sort of intrigued by a couple of the things that the judge had written that had appeared in the newspaper about crime in this community and his perspective, having served as a judge for a number of years. And we're going to talk about some of those things today and a number of issues, legal issues. But I wanted to begin, some of you may know Judge Borowski well, some of you may not know him so well. So we're going to get to know him here for a couple of minutes before we get into some of the issues. And I wanted to begin by saying, you're a local kid. You grew up in Milwaukee. This is home.
Right, I've lived here my entire life. I grew up in the River West area. I went to MPS grade schools, went to high school at Mesmer on 6th and Capitol. I went to college here at Marquette, went to the law school here at Marquette, and have lived here my entire life. And it's a place that I love living and a place I want to stay, and it's a place that means a lot to me.
Public service, how did you get the bug for public service?
Well, I probably got it, honestly. My late father was a candidate for the county board in about 1972, and I was about 6 or 7 years old at the time, and he actually finished third in a primary. He ran for county supervisor, finished third, and I remember two things about that. I remember that I got a dollar coin out of my bank, and I gave that was my campaign contribution. I don't know if it made it onto his finance report or not, but that was, and I remember being just devastated afterwards and just crying that he had lost. But beyond that, my father was a social worker, my mother was a teacher in MPS, and they instilled in us, both myself, my brothers, and my sister, a commitment to community service, doing things, giving back to your community, and so I've tried to do that.
Interesting. One of your brothers, who I know, Greg, works at the newspaper here in town. He's been here at the law school on a number of occasions for different events. What's it like having a brother who's a journalist? Well, is he the black sheep of the family? Or what?
Yes, yeah? He's the black sheep of the family. And I do have one complaint because Marquette, though I'm an alum, never invites me to a Marquette game in the box. And just this weekend, he was in a box for the Marquette game. So I'd like that clarified. I'd like to take care of that at some point in time.
We'll see about that. Let's talk a little bit about your background. You were a trial attorney, you were a court commissioner, and then you were a judge. Walk us through that process. What did you learn from those experiences?
Well, I started my legal practice at O'Neill, Cannon, and Holman. I saw one or two of my former colleagues walk in earlier. After that, I was at a smaller insurance defense firm. I was at another firm, and then I also worked as a court commissioner for the city of Milwaukee. And at the city, we were dealing with relatively low-level offenses, retail theft, disorderly conduct, small-time possession of marijuana, those kinds of things. But it gave me a chance to do some community service, do some public service, get involved, and it gave me a feeling for presiding over cases, handling cases, and from that, I ran for office in 2003. I was fortunate enough to prevail and get elected and go from there.
You've served in a variety of capacities in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Describe some of what you've been up to.
Well, I've had the gamut. I started, as you know, in juvenile court after I got elected in 2003. And I started in juvenile court not knowing really anything about that system. I had handled a few juvenile cases, but it was a very, very new area to me. After juvenile court for 4 years, I went to the misdemeanor division. Most of my time in the misdemeanor division was spent in a domestic violence court, which handles both misdemeanors and felonies. After that, I spent a year in a drug court, and then I spent 3 years in a court that hears exclusively homicides and sexual assaults. I ended that rotation about a year and a half ago, and since then I've been in the civil division doing a half civil, half probate calendar. So other than family court, I've done pretty much every assignment there is at the circuit court level.
Well, I wanted to talk to you a bit about your time as a judge. Well, I'll read what you had to say. This is a piece that appeared back in the Journal Sentinel back in May of 2015, and we're going to talk a little bit about your experience dealing with homicides in this community and crime in this community. And you say in this, Judge, As a judge in a court dedicated to hearing only homicides and sexual assault cases, I presided in well over 100 homicide cases from 2011 to 2014. It was a front row seat to the carnage being wrought in certain parts of the city of Milwaukee. It's an interesting piece. Some people would say it's a provocative piece. Why did you decide to write it?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, I had spent 3 years in the homicide sexual assault court, and about 5 or 6 months before that, I had rotated out of that assignment. So I had the experience of seeing the cases for 3 years, some very violent, very awful offenses. But I was also had the chance for 6 or 8 months to step away from it and think about what I had experienced and what I had seen. As you know, and as some of the people here know, in a homicide court in Milwaukee County, I was, you could say, fortunate or not fortunate, depending on how you look at it, to have some interesting cases and some very, very unfortunate cases that the community's had in the last 5 to 6 years. I presided over the Benjamin Sabina case. That was a case about 3 or 4 years ago on Christmas Eve. He shot his wife, who was an officer in Wauwatosa. Tragic case. I presided over the Morales-Rodriguez case. Some of you will remember that case. That was a case where it was the fetal homicide case where Ms. Morales-Rodriguez found another Latino female, attacked her, killed her, and then cut the baby out from her, took the baby. She was eventually convicted. The baby died. Awful case. The mother and the baby died. But those cases are the outliers. The average case that I saw in Milwaukee County for the 3 years I was there was, to be blunt, a homicide where the victim and the perpetrator look an awful lot alike. And what that means, of course, is that the shooter, in most cases, and the victim are both black males. They're both African-American males. And it was something that bothered me greatly. It's something that I think should bother everybody in this room, and it's something that should bother everybody in our community, not just the city, not just the county, but our entire region. And it was sort of timely. I asked you if I could use this visual aid. There was an article in the paper over the weekend, which of course I didn't know about, but these photos are sort of an example of what caused me to write that article and to try to speak out a little more on this issue. The toll of homicides in Milwaukee. And I didn't count the number on here, but there's probably 90 or 95 photos, and of that number, probably 80 are African-American males. And in most of those cases, they were also shot and killed by African-American males. It's a tragedy, it's an outrage, and it's something that this community needs to do something about. And I felt, given my experience and what I had seen for 3 years, that I had a voice that someone hopefully might listen to and might be able to get things moving and make a change in the right direction.
Let's talk about the why of this, of the statistics and the human lives that are lost. We had Chief Flynn here within the last year, and I asked him, why is this happening? And there is no simple answer, and yet in your piece you tried to give your perspective on what has happened in the community. What do you think has happened? Why is this happening?
Well, I would agree with the chief and agree with others, whether it's the Homicide Review Commission or the mayor or others, that there's no specific one answer. There's probably not any two answers, because homicides in Milwaukee County occur for all sorts of reasons. Some are domestic violence related, some are related to drug dealing, some are related to gangs. Many of the crimes from last year, they don't really have a reason for. Some of them stem from arguments which 20 years ago or 30 years ago would have been resolved with a fight in an alley. Now they're resolved with a gun. So there's no simple answer. One of the root problems, as I see it, is that over the course of the last 15, 20 years, there's been a breakdown in the family in various parts of Milwaukee County. And it's tragic, it's unfortunate, but I think it's the case that someone mentioned this to me not long ago. Obviously, we've had a lot of rise in the last 4 to 5 months in carjackings and violent crimes involving youth. Maybe we'll talk about that later. A city official mentioned to me that, well, if you recall, about 15 to 20 years ago, in the late 90s, early in the last decade, that was when the city of Milwaukee experienced its highest teen pregnancy rate. Well, 15 to 20 years ago, those kids that were being born to 14, 15, 16-year-old mothers are now kids that are out on the street. And they're, in many cases, not being parented or they're not being parented well. And that's part of the equation. Is good parenting, whether it's from a parent or a grandparent or a guardian, going to fix everything? Will it fix every problem? Prevent every child from going astray? Absolutely not. But there is a correlation, in my view. And I've seen it in children's court, I've seen it in drug court, and I've seen it in homicide court. There is a correlation between parenting, whether it's biological parents, foster parents, grandparents, to how that child develops.
You say in the piece that it's time to end the excuses. What do you mean? Are we making excuses for the violent behavior that we see in our community?
Well, what I meant by that, and let me not forget to say that the Chief Judge, Maxine White, wanted me to mention that I'm speaking for myself, not the entire judiciary, just so we're clear. There's 47 judges in Milwaukee County. You'd probably get 47 opinions. Some that would agree.
And she was here, we should say, a couple of months ago.
Some would agree with me, some would disagree.
Your opinion.
It's my opinion.
Okay.
What I mean by excuses is, are some of the factors that people talk about in terms of crime, in terms of especially violent crime factors? Yes, of course. Poverty, drug dealing, lack of education, lack of parental support, obviously those are factors.
Right.
I benefited from being able to, have a two-parent family and parents that cared about me and made sure I was doing my homework, were on top of me if I was a bit astray. And when there's not someone there, obviously that is a factor. But when I talk about excuses, one of the things I don't want to lose sight of, and I mentioned this in the column 8 or 9 months ago, is that even in the most challenged parts of this community, for instance, the 53206 zip code gets talked about a lot. 53206 zip code, which, by the way, as I said, I went to Messmer High School. That's actually in the 53206 zip code. It's in the Capitol Drive, Silver Spring, from about the Freeway West area. The majority of people in those areas, challenged areas, are doing the right thing. The majority of people, and when I say majority, I mean 80, 90, 95% of the people in those communities are trying to do the right thing. Whether it's in a local church group, whether it's at school, whether it's parents doing their best to get their kids, despite challenges, off to school and to get an education. So I don't want the fact of things like poverty and lack of education, while important, to be used as an excuse, or better yet, a justification for something like a shooting or a murder. Because no matter how bad your circumstances are, I can't, not so much as a judge, but just as a person in this community, someone who cares about this community, justify shooting and killing another person. And so often, Mike, it was over such ridiculous things. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the cases I had, 2 examples. One, I have young kids. There were 3 kids in an alley. They're all 18, 19, 20 years old. And the dispute arose, depending on who you believed, over a jacket or whose alley it was. Well, as I pointed out, it's actually the city of Milwaukee's alley, but they didn't get that. So the kids are in the alley, and they get in an argument, and the one kid says, "I want your jacket." The other kid says, "No." So let's say you and I are the 2 that are attacking the other kid. The one kid says, "Pop that MFer." The other kid grabs his gun, shoots him dead right in the alley. No thought, no consideration of the consequences whatsoever. And he eventually either was found guilty or pled guilty to the shooting, was found guilty of a homicide, was doing a very, very long sentence. But at sentencing, I asked him, I said, okay, you're sitting there in the alley, you're 18, 19 years old, you get in an argument with this other kid over a jacket or an alley, or somebody said something, and your friend yells, "Pop him." Did you ever think for 1 minute, well, why would I pop him? What are the consequences of popping him? And he gave me an honest answer. He said, "No, Judge, I never thought about it." Now, that's a bad situation. It's a sad commentary on some of the youth, and it's a minority, obviously, of the population, but some youth that are growing up in our community, that you can't see a future down the road for yourself, that you can't see a positive role model at home, that you've gone so far astray still as a teenager that when some idiot friend of yours says, "Pop that MFer," you just grab a gun and shoot him. Well, so now you have, and the article talks about this, tragedy on both sides, because I have one family who comes in and their son's dead. And he's not going to get to graduate from high school or college. He's not going to get married. He's not going to go on to have a job, he's not going to have grandkids. And on the other side, you have a family who's equally upset and equally devastated because their son is now, for different reasons, most likely not going to get married, not going to graduate from college, not going to have a family, because he's going to spend the next 30 years of his life in prison.
So what do we do about it? And I want to begin by asking, because of your experience, both handling homicides and in juvenile court, one of the things you've heard from the chief in recent days, recent weeks, in response to sort of this spate of carjackings, is he says judges need to get tougher with these kids. They do not understand that there are consequences for their actions because they steal a car and shortly thereafter they're back out on the streets and they steal another one and it happens over and over again. And we got to send them a message so that they understand you cannot do this. What's your response to that?
Well, when I started in children's court, without speaking for my good friend Judge Ashley, there were eight judges in children's court. And this was 2003 to 2007 when I was out there. And I think he and I were probably among the quicker to have consequences up front quickly for a juvenile offender, whether that meant short-term detention at the detention facility in children's court or long-term placement for a year or two at Ethan Allen, which has been closed, or at Lincoln Hills. I think you do need to have upfront, quick consequences. But to respond to the chief's concern, are the judges too lenient? When I think of questions like that, that's sort of like saying, is the state assembly too conservative, or is the Milwaukee Common Council too liberal? The judiciary, the 47 of us, are of course not monolithic. There are some judges who have one view on crime and how juveniles should be dealt with. There are other judges like myself that might have a different view. So it depends on each particular case. And of course, we as a judge, first and foremost, our job, and the chief judge, not the chief of police, has mentioned this to me, and I think she mentioned this when she was here. Our job as a judiciary, first and foremost, is to provide a forum for a fair, impartial resolution of a case. Now, after a case has been resolved, whether it's with a juvenile or an adult, we have a variety of things that we need to look at, one of which is protecting the community. We need to look at the gravity of a particular juvenile's offense or an adult offense, their character, their upbringing, their education, a whole variety of things. And one of those things is protecting the public. And someone said recently, it may have been Alderman Murphy, that if you're putting kids out who've committed a violent offense with a quote, unquote, slap on the wrist, you're not doing them any favors. I would agree with that for two reasons. When I was in juvenile court, often said to the kids, look, you've messed up, you've got your one or two chances, this is your last chance, now you're going to Ethan Allen, and now you're going to Lincoln Hills. And I would say as much, again, you're dealing with 15, 16-year-olds for the most part, as much as you might hate that thought right now, being taken from your family, placed at Ethan Allen, placed in Lincoln Hills, I'm doing you a favor. And they, of course, don't see it then. But my point then, and my point would continue to be with the judges that are in juvenile court, better that a kid spends a year at, now it's Lincoln Hills, that's a whole other issue we could talk about, but in a correctional facility or away from their family, away from crime, so that they're not in front of me 6 or 8 or 10 years later. And I saw both results. Just within the last few years, I had kids, my court clerk, my court reporter, my staff could tell you, they saw kids that I saw as a juvenile that then years later were in front of me in drug court, or in a couple cases years later were in front of me in a homicide. Well, there's only so much power a judge has, and it's not just me, it's family, friends, the community, their parents, others who have influence on them. But the message obviously didn't sink in 2004 or 5 or 6, and now, let's say in 2014, I'm sentencing them to 20 years in prison. So that's sort of my view on that topic.
What's the role of guns in this? Because Chief Flynn, when he was here, expressed concerns about whether passage of concealed carry back in 2012 might in some way be causing this increase in fatal shootings. He also wants some tougher sentencing for gun offenses. What's your take on that?
Remind me to go back to guns, but let me give you the second example. I was going to give you two examples. So that was a negative example of what can happen with juveniles and when I see them 8 or 10 years later. Conversely, in the last couple of years, and as recently as last week, I had a woman who's probably in her mid-20s walk up to me and she said, "Hey, you're Judge Borowski, right?" And being a judge, I was a little leery to whether you answer that question or not.
Who's asking?
Right, you don't know who's asking and why they're asking. I said, "Yeah, why?" And she said, "Well, you were my judge. You remember me?" And I said, "Sort of." But this was a girl who, 10 years ago, she explained her story to me. She was a juvenile delinquent. She was a runaway. And I don't mean delinquent to sound too harsh, but she was a juvenile delinquent. She was a runaway. She was also, I think, a CHIPS kid. She didn't have a good family situation. And she was a young girl that I referred to as one of our runners. In other words, I'd put her back at home, or I'd put her with a foster parent, or I'd put her in a group home, and she'd be there for 10 minutes, and then boom, she's out of the house or out of the placement, and a month later or a week later, she'd be picked up in Chicago or picked up on 17th and National or picked up with someone who may be involved in, child or human trafficking or prostitution. Well, anyway, she came up to me, and this is the second young female in the last 2 years, to thank me. She gave me a hug and said, "Judge, I really appreciate what you did for me," and that helped to turn around my life. She's like, "I didn't like you at the time much, and I didn't like you putting me in jail repeatedly, but eventually I got the message and I turned my life around." She said she finished high school, she has a job, and this is now 8 or 10 years later. So it can go either way. Sure. But as a judge, that story, which doesn't happen too often, but is very, very rewarding.
So let's go back to guns for a moment. What is your belief about the role of guns in what we're seeing here? Is it a change in gun laws? Is it something else? What do you think?
Well, as I said in my piece a number of months ago, it's very, very clear that easy access to weapons, guns in particular, is a serious problem in Milwaukee. Now, having said that, it's obvious to everybody. I think the chief of police and the mayor and Maxine White and everybody would know that those guns are not being bought legally in most cases. They're being bought by straw purchasers. They're being stolen from other people. They're being bought illegally. They're being bought on the street. And easy access to guns certainly is a significant problem. I probably pushed the envelope a little in my piece a number of months ago and suggested that at some point in time, maybe we need to consider mandatory minimums for gun offenses. And as a judge, I think I can speak for most of my colleagues, and most judges don't like having their discretion taken away. Judges like to be able to decide on each set of facts and circumstances and case. Each one's unique, each one's specific into and onto itself. But I thought it's time that, given the just incredible rise of gun violence, and particularly felon in possession of firearms cases, that there should be some mandatory minimums. I'm sure it had little or nothing to do with my 2 cents, but there was, in a rare instance these days, some bipartisan agreement, Democrats and Republicans, in the last session, and some mandatory minimums have been passed on felon in possession of firearms cases. And as you see, whether it's in the article or when the police chief talks about it or the district attorney talks about it, most of the individuals, youth or adults that are involved in gun crimes, very, very many of them are felons and are not allowed to own or possess guns. And there needs to be a serious consequence for that. So I think that's an issue, and I think that is something that's being addressed. And I was happy to see that on that particular issue, you had Democrats from the city of Milwaukee who were pushing to have some mandatory minimums, but you also had Republicans from outlying areas and some fairly bipartisan support to deal with that issue. Is it a panacea? No, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
You wrote another piece for the paper that was about the division of corrections, essentially, and the issue of extended supervision. So you have people who have served time in prison, but they're now out in the community and supposed to be monitored by the Department of Corrections. Is that an issue that you see, that there simply are not enough people in the Department of Corrections to do the kind of monitoring that needs to be done?
Candidly, right now, I think the Department of Corrections has a lot of problems and a lot of things on their plate. As you saw, and I'm, again, certainly not going to speak for her, but Maxine White, our chief judge in this district was, she visited Lincoln Hills, she went up there with some legislators. She and
Said she couldn't sleep at night.
Right.
She came back.
She said she couldn't sleep. I did speak to her briefly. She said it was an awful experience, that what's going on there is terrible. And I don't know why that's changed, because I told her, and I'm not sure if she's ever served in children's court or not, but I told her when I was in children's court, I visited Ethan Allen a couple times, and this was, again, 8 or 10 years ago. But they had some very good programming. It was very well run. It was very clean. It was very respectful. You are, even though you're dealing with kids that have made sometimes very, very bad mistakes, grave criminal mistakes, you are still dealing with kids, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So obviously there's a very, very serious problem at Lincoln Hills. The issue for the DOC arose with me, not so much in my homicide assignment, but in the other half of the assignment with sexual assaults. And what I experienced was most sexual assaults that you see in Milwaukee County or statewide are going to be charged as felonies, and very, very many of them, if not almost all, if you're found guilty or you plead guilty, that person's going to end up in prison. Some of them, of course, and for instance, you might have someone where the defendant's 19 and the victim's 15 or 16, and it ends up as a 4th-degree sexual assault. It ends up as a misdemeanor resolution. Those people oftentimes, at the recommendation of the DA's office and with my acquiescence determination, would be put on probation, but with a very serious and significant list of conditions. Because even though they're young, and even though it might have been a 4th-degree sexual assault, those are the kind of cases that you need to divert and correct, and really correct that person's behavior so that it doesn't get worse down the road, or so that they're not back in court. It became an issue for me when I just sort of sua sponte, on my own, decided to start setting review hearings to see if the DOC was doing what they needed to do. And that came from a background from a couple years before that when I was in domestic violence court. In domestic violence court in Milwaukee County, this is a model that's gone on for the last 12 to 15 years under 3 different chiefs. We have review hearings about once a month. They're set out about every 3 or 4 months, but once a month we have review hearings to see how this person you put on probation, the probationer, and the Department of Corrections are doing. Is the probationer doing what you asked, and is the DOC doing what you asked? So I decided to start doing that with sexual assault type cases, sexually based offenses, usually 4th-degree sexual assaults. And it very quickly came to my attention that there was very, very little monitoring going on. I'd have cases where I put somebody on probation. Let's say I put them on probation last week, and I do a review in June. It's been 6 months, and they've not had any programming. They haven't seen their probation officer. They haven't gone to a counselor to deal with their sexual assault issues. They haven't started programming. I found that incredibly problematic. Some of the people here know me. I can be rather blunt. I took a few people at the DOC to task rather forcefully, and eventually I think that changed. But I think the DOC has a very difficult job, as many of us do in the criminal justice system. But I think they need to do a better job of monitoring people who are on probation so that hopefully they're diverted and don't end up in jail or prison, and then especially monitoring people that are returned from prison back to Milwaukee or back to their community.
You mentioned diversion, and I want to touch on this because there's a lot of talk in today's world about criminal justice reform. There's been there's some talk going on right now in Wisconsin about that. You said on a local level there's already a number of practices aimed at not sending everyone to prison where you think other punishment might work. Is Milwaukee County, for instance, a little ahead of the curve on this compared to the rest of the state?
I think Milwaukee is a bit ahead of the curve compared to not just the rest of the state, but certain parts of the country. I know there are a few district attorneys in the office or in the audience and a few public defenders. There are lots of programs at the local level, many of which I'm not involved in, but that do their best to divert lower level offenders. For instance, the kid who's 19 and is caught with some marijuana on him. Deferred prosecution agreements, community prosecution. Once a case comes into court, obviously depending on the severity, the possibility of expungement. I think, certainly speaking for myself in the year that I spent in drug court, I never wanted to have, and I think honestly, most DAs in Milwaukee County, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think John Chisholm doesn't want the average 18 or 19 or 20-year-old kid to have a felony record for marijuana or first or second time offense of that sort. So there's all kinds of diversion programs, as I said, deferred prosecution agreements, diversions in the field from community prosecutors. Once you get into court, cases going from a felony to a misdemeanor to avoid increases in the jail or prison population. And those are the kind of people, young adults, young kids, who have potential, who have needs, and can be diverted, and can hopefully have their behaviors changed.
Are there, and maybe the audience would be interested in this, based on what you know, are there a lot of people in prisons around this state, in jail around this state for minor drug offenses? I mean, that's one of the arguments in the need for criminal justice reform is we have simply too many people in prison, that we could release some of these people, that we could save money as a result. States like Texas and South Carolina with Republican governors are doing it. Wisconsin should do it. What do we know about who's in prison? Are there a lot of people with minor nonviolent offenses in prison?
That's a topic that comes up a lot in the community and the media. And I was at a seminar last summer, and part of it was conducted by the Department of Corrections. And I actually just reviewed those stats again today before coming over here. The Wisconsin prison population as of 2000, and it's been consistent for the most part over the last 5-6 years, has anywhere from 22 to 24,000 people in prison.
Many more than a state like Minnesota, correct?
More than some similar states, yes, more than Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So there's 22, 23,000 people in the state prison system at any given time. That's the average. About 70% of that prison population are violent offenses. Armed robberies, homicides, attempted homicides, child abuse, violent offenses. There are some other offenses, obviously, if you're a 5th, 6th, 7th OWI offender, you might be in prison, property crimes. But drug offenses, again, based on DOC stats that were current through about a year and a half ago, make up about 8% of the state prison population, 8%. And that includes things like possession with intent to deliver heroin and possession with intent to deliver cocaine. Some people...
Nonviolent offenses, but...
Well, depends what you consider nonviolent. My view, and this will sound flip, but I've said it on the record a few times in court, and a nonviolent drug offense, there's two kinds of nonviolent drug offenses. Okay, if you have a kid in the backyard and he's smoking marijuana or he has a nickel bag with his buddy, I'm not condoning it, but okay, that's nonviolent. Or if you go to Walgreens to pick up a prescription, that's nonviolent. But possession with intent to deliver heroin, possession with intent to deliver cocaine, in my view, those are violent offenses because of a whole number of things. First of all, the problems that they cause in the community. No one in this room, whether you live in Brookfield or the east side of Milwaukee or 45th and Hampton, wants a drug house on their block. And why don't you want a drug house on their block? Because there are things that are attendant with drug houses. You know, it's not just people coming in and out all hours of the day and all hours of the night, which does occur. But a lot of times, there's gangs that are involved, there's weapons that are involved, guns. Anybody who reads the newspaper on a daily basis or watches the news, you can't go more than a week or two, a month at the most before you see. The most recent one that sticks out in my memory is a younger individual who's being charged with a homicide. He shot and killed someone over a $50 bag of marijuana. Now, I'm talking more about the heroin and cocaine cases, but drug offenses stemming from drug houses and drug dealing and gangs, as it filters down, or better yet, filters up, in my view, it is a version of violence. It's a version of violence in that community. It's not to mention what it does to the people that are using the drugs, the people that are selling the drugs, the bad decisions that they make. People who are using heroin, which is a problem not just in Milwaukee, but all across the state, and there have been things the state legislature's done to address that. It's a problem in Green Bay, it's a problem in Mequon, it's a problem in Milwaukee. But those types of offenses, heroin and cocaine in particular, people do things that they would not otherwise do. You know, they might rob you or I when we're walking out of the law school. They might rob somebody that they would not otherwise do if they weren't under the influence of that particular drug. So two big points. A, the overall prison population is about 7 or 8% nonviolent drug offenses. But again, that includes heroin and cocaine, which cause immense, enormous problems for the community.
So I hear you saying if we go the route of criminal justice reform on a statewide basis, we need to be careful. Is that an accurate portrayal of what you're saying?
Right, I think that's very accurate. I mean, someone who, again, when you look at a drug offense, okay, on the one end you have misdemeanors, marijuana, maybe first-time possession of cocaine. On the other hand, you have, and I saw cases like this in homicide court, you have what are called Len Bias offenses. Some of you may remember that name. Len Bias was a professional athlete. Actually did not get to be a professional athlete. He played, I think, at Maryland in the early to mid-'80s, was drafted by the Celtics. He OD'd of a drug overdose, I think it was cocaine, on the night he was drafted. In the last 25, 30 years, most states in the country have passed Len Bias laws dealing with cocaine, but now largely heroin, where if you and I are using heroin and I sell it to you and you use it, or I give it to you and you use it and you die as a result of that use, I could be prosecuted for a Len Bias homicide for the delivery of that cocaine or heroin. So, you know, one of the difficult things for judges is where you draw the line. And obviously as a judge, we get cases at the end of the line. You know, by the time someone ends up in front of us in adult court, they may have a juvenile record, they may not. They may have graduated from high school, they may not. They may have a good family upbringing or not. There's this whole variety of things that have gone on in their lives. Then they get a criminal offense. So A, are they arrested or not by the officer where there's discretion? Then it goes to the district attorney's office and the DAs, do they charge that person? Once they charge that person, then it goes past the commissioner, then it gets in front of us for a trial or maybe possibly an eventual guilty plea, and we've seen them at the end of the spectrum. The one thing I will say is not only is it tough to make that call as a judge, it's also tough to make that call as a prosecutor. And I think that the people in this community, whether it's the chief judge or the public defender's office or the DA's office, John Chisholm, everything they're doing may not be perfect, and I certainly don't claim that everything I've done or said is anywhere near perfect, but I think they're making significant efforts and significant strides. This is not to go too far off topic, but the district attorney's office is very, very overwhelmed, I think, with what's going on in Milwaukee County. I know some of the homicide prosecutors, and just over the course of the last year, 15 months, you go from roughly 80 homicides to almost 150. You know, they're taxed, to put it mildly. So are the police, so are the people that are investigating those offenses. But for the most part, and there are some DAs in the office, in the audience, and I won't point them out, but they're very good at their jobs, they're very conscientious, they care about making that front-end decision so that before they end up in front of me, a good decision's been made so that I can hopefully make a good and fair decision.
I've got two more quick questions. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions from the folks here in the audience today. This deals with your current role in civil court. You deal with probate cases, and so you have contact or knowledge of what's happening at the Milwaukee County Mental Health Complex. And there are plans to put a number of people back in the community. There are plans to close the mental health complex and have a private contractor take over the responsibilities. Maybe some of the people who are working there now would end up working for these private contractors. But I'm wondering do you have any concerns about what we're about to do in terms of putting people back into the community, or in terms of how we're handling this transition, which is yet to take place, we should say?
Right, as many of you are probably familiar, the mental health complex in Milwaukee County has had all kinds of problems in the last 5 to 10 years. And there are sort of two aspects of that. There was a long-term facility. Both of them are on the Watertown Plank near the west side area. There's a long-term facility that just within the last couple of weeks has been closed, and people who were under long-term care, 5, 10, 15 years, have now for the most part all been placed in the community. The other half of that is short-term acute care. And so what you have in those situations, and what I see in my role now is, and I have a half civil, half probate calendar, as part of the probate assignment is I see people who have short-term acute mental health crises that manifest themselves in an attempted suicide, threatening to kill or harm somebody else. They're brought to the mental health complex because they need immediate short-term care. At any given time, that facility has, could be as low as 90 or 100, could be 150, could be as high as 200 individuals. My concern there is, I guess, this. The people that are there, and it's a difficult thing, honestly, Mike, as a judge, to commit someone to a mental health complex or to send somebody to prison. I certainly don't get any pleasure out of either of those things, and can't think of any judge that does. But the people that are at the short-term facility, and again, as part of this process, within the last couple years, actually last year, there was an RFP, request for proposals, put out by the county executive, and there were two bidders. I don't recall the two bidders, but they were deemed to neither of them be appropriate for this role. Now, I agree with what sometimes people refer to as mainstreaming of people that have mental health issues. It's been mandated from federal court level to a state court level, and it's the model that's gone on across the country and continues to go on across the country, and I believe it should. My concern, and it's been tabled, is how Milwaukee County deals with this going forward. I think that the county executive has good intentions. I think Hector Colonna has good intentions, and I think with their help and the help of the judiciary and others, we can figure out the eventual answer, but I'm not sure that the eventual answer can be privatization. I think, it's, again, just my own opinion, but I think that that's a role, short-term acute mental health care, which might in many cases mean someone's in a locked unit for a week or a month while they're getting stabilized. That's something that is a role of government. There are certain things that I think government needs to do, whether it's plowing the streets or getting the garbage or police or fire. Mental health care, falls, I think, under that category. And I think it was evidenced by the fact that they put out a request for proposals, not just locally or regionally, but nationally. They had two bidders, and neither of them were appropriate, and now it's been tabled for a year or two. I think it's something that we can work on as a community and can solve, but it's going to take some work.
My final question, and I mentioned this earlier at the beginning of our hour, that you're interested in politics. You've always been interested in politics, and so sometimes when there are jobs that are available, your name comes up, and so your name came up in connection with whether or not you might run for Attorney General a few years ago. Your name has come up about whether you might run for State Supreme Court. Does running for statewide office have some appeal to you?
Well, my name has come up, and someone asked me before I did this, a friend of mine saw me yesterday and said, hey, are you going to make any big announcements? I said, no. No big announcements, but yes, I do have an interest in maybe either or both of those positions, maybe some other local office at some point. I, for the most part, love being a judge, and I think it's a very, very important role. But I've been a judge for 12 years, and at some point in time, I'd like to consider, if the opportunity presents itself, something else, whether it's Attorney General, potentially the Supreme Court, maybe something of a local nature. I'll just leave it at that, and people can speculate.
You won't rule it out.
Right, I won't rule it out.
Yeah,
yes,
that's always a good one. Right. Don't rule it out.
I won't rule it out.
Yeah. Let's take some questions from the audience. For those of you who've been here before, you know the routine. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. Keep your finger down on it. We'll be able to hear your question. If you're seated in the back, Ryan, the gentleman in the red shirt with the microphone, will bring the mic over your way, and you can ask your question there. So please raise your hand if you have a question for Judge Borowski. There's a gentleman right behind you there. Mm-hmm.
Judge, what are your views on legalization of marijuana use in Wisconsin, a la Colorado and Washington, and maybe some others?
Well, that falls into the category of a decision that I think the legislature needs to make. I think in some cases, marijuana can be, I don't like the term entry drug to cocaine and other things, but I think that's a decision that's best left to the legislature and something that I should probably punt on in case one of those cases ever comes in front of me. It's a good question, though.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, we'll go back there. Yeah.
We hear about court overload in every kind of court at every time, and we can't get the criminals and bad actors to stop being bad for a while to lighten the load. Is there some kind of proposal that could lighten the load? Could there be a group of 12 that were appointed as interim judges to help lighten loads?
Well, I'll explain. Some of you in the audience, of course, know this. In Milwaukee County, there's 47 judges in Milwaukee County, and we're broken up into divisions. Other than Dane County and Waukesha, the rest of the state are judges of general jurisdiction at the circuit court level. So one week they could be handling criminal cases, the next week they're handling auto accidents or civil matters. But in Milwaukee, we're broken up into divisions. And the divisions basically break down like this. There's 8 judges in children's court, there's about 12 of us in civil, there's 5 or 6 in family court, and then there's about 21 or 22 in the criminal division. That includes misdemeanors, that includes felonies, that includes domestic violence, homicide, armed robberies, and everything else you can think of in the criminal division. In terms of lightening the load, this is a bit out of left field, but one thing that I've thought of and considered is in some other states, I was at a seminar a couple years ago where a judge from, I think it was Cleveland, was speaking, and in some other states, municipal courts are allowed to deal with things that are closer to what we consider misdemeanors. Now, that would take legislative change, it would take the acquiescence of, the legislature, the governor, but, for instance, you might be able to move misdemeanor offenses, carrying a concealed weapon, drug offenses, those kinds of things, to municipal courts, at least in larger municipalities, Milwaukee, Madison, Waukesha, maybe Green Bay. That's a thought that I've had, it's a possibility. Are the courts overloaded? I guess it depends on your perspective. We've certainly been busy, continue to be busy, and I don't see any lightening of the load in the near future. But that's a thought that I've had that could be considered at some point in time.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
If you knew you were going to be a judge when you were going to the university, is there something you would have paid a little more attention to while at the university?
I'm sure he paid attention.
I paid attention in every class.
I wonder if we have any professors in here who can attest to that or not.
No, but my anecdote there would be when I was in law school, Professor Christine Wiseman, who you probably remember that name. She was here for many, many years. She went on later to go, I think, to Creighton, a couple of other schools. And I was in a trial practice class with her, and some of the best advice she gave me, and there's a couple of DAs sitting behind you, they'll, I think, agree with this, is it's good if you're a lawyer, if you're a practicing attorney, to get along with the judge, but it's more important to get along with the clerk, because if you don't get along with the clerk, you never get to see the judge. So
That's good advice.
I listened most of the time during law school.
Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned some of the lesser misdemeanors possibly going to municipal court. Now, that does happen, it's under the discretion of the DA and the arresting officer whether they write a, let's say, possession of marijuana as a municipal ordinance violation or as a criminal matter in criminal court. So the simple solution, in my humble opinion, would be that the officers and the district attorneys decide to send them more to municipal court. And not only the larger cities like Milwaukee or Green Bay or Madison, but also Pewaukee, Elm Grove, those municipal courts handle a lot of the lesser misdemeanor matters. So it's in the discretion of the officer and the DA.
For those of you who aren't familiar, that's true. I mean, a police officer, depending, let's say they stop somebody with marijuana, they're going to charge them with possession of marijuana. It's a small amount, depending on a whole variety of factors. That could be anything from a municipal ticket to a misdemeanor to it could go to a deferred prosecution agreement in circuit court. That's true, counsel, that does happen. My thought, and it's just a sort of outside the box thought, would be, and it would require maybe increasing the number of municipal judges potentially in Milwaukee, Dane County, Green Bay, but to move more of them that actually are charged as misdemeanors into a municipal court, freeing up more judges in Milwaukee County to handle felonies, to handle civil cases, to handle the more serious matters. Mm-hmm. But you're right, there's a lot of discretion there.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question related to race. As a white, mature woman, I have felt once or twice in dealing with police that I benefited from what you could call positive discrimination. And I'm wondering to what extent you observe outcomes for people, or, you know, the fact that they're standing in front of you, to negative discrimination?
Well, that's a tough one. I guess I'd answer it this way. I spent a year, as I said, in drug court before taking over in the homicide, sexual assault court. And for the most part, and when I say for the most part, I really mean for the most part, most police officers that I've come in contact with, whether they've testified on the witness stand, or they've come to me for a search warrant, or they've appeared in court on a case for me or another judge, are doing a difficult job under difficult circumstances. Now, having said that, I remember a case or two when I was in drug court where, and this was not a positive chapter in Milwaukee's history, it's a chapter that's hopefully been closed, but I heard of a case or two where either directly or indirectly it came up in my case where a defendant, who was an African-American male in most cases, alleged that they had been cavity searched or that their pants had been pulled down and that the drugs had been planted on them. And I'll be honest, I mean, ma'am, you and I don't know each other. I think of all my strengths and weaknesses as a judge, I certainly have weaknesses. One of my strengths is I like to think that I'm not naive. I grew up in the River West neighborhood. I've lived in Milwaukee my entire life. But at that point in time, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't say I dispensed it out of hand, but I was sort of shocked at that. I'm thinking there's no way on earth that any police officer in Milwaukee County is going to grab someone, whether they're white, black, Latino, south side, north side, and do a cavity search or do half of a strip search out in public. I mean, I found that impossible to believe. And again, I like to think I'm not naive. Well, as it turned out, 3, 4 years later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, obviously that was the case. It led to the prosecution of officers in Milwaukee County, MPD officers. Eventually, a number of them were convicted, a number were thrown off the force. And as you probably saw, there was just a fairly large settlement reached between the city of Milwaukee and about 70 victims of these offenses. As a police officer, as a DA, as a public defender, as a court commissioner, or I as a judge, you have to do everything in your power to be fair and impartial. One of the things that we've gone through as judges in the last 2 years, and this started with Judge Kramer as our prior chief judge, and it continued this last fall with Judge White, is some training, and this is sort of where, Mike, we're sort of, I guess you could say, on the cutting edge of some of these issues. Training so that judges and prosecutors and public defenders and people involved in the system can recognize their own inherent potential biases or biases and how they can deal with them and how they can avoid a bias that may be inherent that they grew up with and not let that affect their job as much as possible. Have I seen what might be characterized as discrimination? Probably, but it's in very, very rare circumstances within the system. You know, I'll give you an example. Most of the DAs, you know, I see DAs that could care less what the color is of the person that they're prosecuting. They're going to give that person, hopefully, the same offer if the set of facts is the same, whether you're white, Latino, African American, Hmong, whatever the case might be. And I, as a judge, will call them out if I ever think that they're not giving people the same treatment. You shouldn't be treated better because you're a white female, and no one should be treated worse because they're a young African American male, for example.
Mm-hmm. Other question? Yes.
Could you reflect on how we choose our Supreme Court, state Supreme Court justices? Do you feel that it should be an election or an appointment or a commission?
That's an interesting question. Well, I'll preface this by saying that Judge Donald, who's in Milwaukee County, who's a circuit court judge, is a colleague of mine, and I'm supporting him, so just for full disclosure. Also, have I thought about running for the Supreme Court? Yes, I may at some point in time in the future. Either way, the way I look at it, it's a political process. You either run for office, and I think, unfortunately, the Supreme Court in the last 10 years, 15 years, but particularly the last 5 to 10 in Wisconsin has become much more political than it used to be. And there's some blame for that, I think, on both sides, left and right, liberal and conservative. You have tons and tons of dollars, I mean hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into Supreme Court races that 5 or 10 years ago would have never occurred. Some people would argue that the former Chief Justice, Shirley Abramson, is very, very in favor of elections. I tend to still be in favor of elections over appointments. The argument for appointments, of course, is you can take away the political advertising, take away having to raise money, take away having to run around the state. And even with, let's say, a judicial selection committee, let's say you, at the federal level, Senator Johnson and Senator Baldwin both have appointed a commission that they basically agree on. It sort of, to me, amounts to 3 conservatives and 3 liberals. But ultimately, it's still a political appointment. You're going to get a different appointment from Governor Doyle than you're going to get from Governor Walker. You're going to get a different appointment from President Obama than you would have from President Bush. Personally, I think as unlikely, or strike that, as unpleasant as democracy can be, I think elections are still better, but it's incumbent on people to, and judicial elections are very, very hard to follow. I think the best judges are the most independent, the judges that can hear from both sides, take both sides to task if necessary. I think the elections are better, but it requires an educated, thoughtful, participating electorate.
I'm going to end with one final question. I see a few of our students in here, a few young attorneys. You had a good piece of advice when you were in law school, but now you're a judge. What's your advice to them should they come to your courtroom? What should they know when they walk into Judge Borowski's courtroom?
Always be prepared, which...
And on time?
And on time, yes. I'm even iffy on the on-time thing, but be prepared. And you'd be surprised, Mike. I mean, I'd like to think that everybody who graduates from Marquette, as I'm an alum here, is prepared and knows the ropes, but I have a law clerk who's here and an intern that's just going to start with me who's here right now, and I give them both the same advice that best when you come into court that you know your case, you know your client, and you can address the judge and address the issues in the case. And if you're not prepared or you're going to make a mistake, do it quickly, tell the judge, fall on the sword, and get it out of the way so that you give it to them and I don't have to figure it out later.
Okay. I'm going to wrap things up there, but before we go, I just want to mention a couple of things about upcoming events here at the law school. On Thursday, we will have our next On the Issue session. It'll be on Waukesha's water diversion request. As I think I've said to a few of you in the past, Waukesha wants to divert Lake Michigan water because of concerns about the water in Waukesha and surrounding communities. There's radium in the water. They have low water tables. So they're looking to divert water and then send back the water to the Root River. We'll be talking with the mayor of Waukesha, Sean Riley, and the mayor of Racine, John Dickard, who opposes the request. And then on Friday, it's already full, so no seats, but you can watch it live streaming on our website. Senator Ron Johnson will be here. Senator Feingold was here last week. Having said that, I'd like to thank everybody in the room for their interest, their time, their attention today, and most of all, thanks to Judge David Borowski for being with us. Judge, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.